other thing. If it's just if it's strangulation, it's a felony. And let's see what else was I supposed to say? Oh, if there's any other questions for those that are online, please put it in the chat. And Dan from my sister's house is going to be monitoring those, and we'll try and answer those as easily as possible. So now I'd like to welcome Brian Bennett. Thank you so much.
All right, so I have to warn you, I'm a pacer. That doesn't mean I'm from Indiana. That means I walk around a lot. I have a lot of energy. So anyway, so it's I'm excited to be with all of you today. Thanks to MUSC for the opportunity, my sister's house, who else, with the library for the space available, and there's probably someone else I don't know about, but I know that we have a very diverse audience. We have medical professionals, we have victim advocates, we have law enforcement, and who knows whatever else. But I'm excited to be with you here today to talk about something I'm very passionate about. Full disclosure, I am not a clinician. I've never been a clinician. I would like to be a clinician if somebody wants to pay to go to medical school. So my entire experience in the professional realm has been in law enforcement. And so 24 years, 25 years coming up in January. I hit my 25-year mark, but pretty much my focus has always been issues of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. I came to an awareness about non-fatal strangulation back in 2015 after attending a federal prosecutor training at the NAC, which is the National Advocacy Center at the University of South Carolina. That's where they train federal prosecutors. And many of you are familiar with the organization, the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. They are the ones that hosted that training back in 2015 and gave us a 4-day advanced course. And I was sitting in that class, and I could remember case after case after case that I had worked in my law enforcement career up to that point where I did not get it, I did not understand, I missed the signs and symptoms, and the stark reality was, to me, is what happened to those victim survivors. I would probably say at some point in the last 25 years, some of those survivors became victims of a fatality. And that really hit me pretty hard. And so the intent of talking about this is to prevent homicides, to prevent injury, to get our victims / patients the appropriate triage, because I'm all about offender accountability. I want to put criminals in jail who violate the law, but the first most important thing to me is patient care, victim survivor care. And the more awareness that we have about this, the more eyes that know and people that hear and see, is a better opportunity to have that triage at those most opportune times that we come across these individuals. So my email address is right here. You'll see it towards the end. So let's go ahead and go through this. I'm going to give, I got to give acknowledgement. Some of the slides in here are not of my design. They were allowed to be used by the Institute, the Strangulation Training Institute, which has had different names, but they've allowed me to use some of these as we go through. And so I always point people back to the group here because they really started the work 20 years ago. They've got a large network of professionals, both legal, medical, you name it, that are constantly updating curriculum, updating research. And this is something I tap into all the time. So anytime a new class comes out, they've had classes for defense attorneys, prosecutors, coroners, medical examiners, you name it. They've put courses out, and I take everyone, whether it's my discipline or not, because I want to be well-rounded into all these areas. So I will say, if I say something that is incorrect, because some of y'all have a lot more medical knowledge than me, if I say something incorrect, please correct me and let's get it right, because I wouldn't say I'm the keeper of all knowledge or all experience. So let's keep that in mind as well. So these are our objectives today. We're going to talk about the increased need for non-fatal strangulation awareness across multiple disciplines. We're going to talk about the mechanics and mechanisms of strangulation. Big part of that's going to have to focus on anatomy, which many of y'all in here have had, more than your fill of anatomy, but we'll kind of touch on the basics for those who don't have that familiarization. We're going to talk about strangulation risk and evaluation. So, what does strangulation actually do? What are the risks associated with it? And how can we properly evaluate it? Risk to others by those that strangle. It's not just the person who is being strangled, but there's a lot of collateral damage. There's a lot of collateral injury from those who strangle. And it's much more broad than people realize. We're going to talk about real briefly at the end about the development of the bill that's been around for about 6 years now that has been introduced. And then the last thing, which is something I'm super excited about, but there's some emerging technology that by all accounts from the people that specialize with this technology could be the next best forensic tool in abuse and assault investigations. And I'm going to toot my own horn for a minute. I brought this idea up in 2016. To this point, no one else in the world had thought about it. And so it's been a labor of love since 2016. And we just had an international virtual conference with these professionals. This past Sunday, I did my next presentation on the update of that program. And so we're excited about starting to actually do the research to validate this for criminal forensics. But many of y'all will understand when we get there that there's the basis in the medical field already. So we'll talk about that. So some of y'all know who Gail Strack is. Gail Strack is the co-founder of the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. She was a former defense attorney. And I'm just going to, her quote right here, "Our study proves that most victims of strangulation will not have visible external injuries." And you can read for yourself. Because of those lack of external injuries, we as far as the populace, society, specialists, have minimized how serious it is. And so I'm going to give you my own example a little bit later that I think makes a really, really good point to back up what she's saying. So we've gotten too locked in to external injuries, okay? And that being the kind of the barometer by which it did or did not happen. Dr. Dean Hawley, this man is amazing. I tell people I'm not a clinician, but he is one of the internationally recognized experts in strangulation. He was the dean over the clinical forensics at the University of Indiana. Unfortunately, a number of years ago, he suffered a severe stroke. So he is out of the teaching world. But this guy is amazing and literally spent 30 to 40 years focusing specifically on strangulation issues. Fatal strangulation can occur without any external evidence on the human body. Well, there it is again. The overemphasis on external injuries. And his other quote over here, "The best way to document strangulation is by autopsy." We don't want to get to that point. We don't want people to die and be on that table. And that's when we figure out it was a strangulation incident. And I don't have to tell, y'all probably know this already, but there's not this automatic autopsy that occurs when somebody dies. I mean, autopsies are expensive. They're time consuming. And if there's no indications of foul play, a lot of times it doesn't happen. And so potentially we have victims out there who are dying from complications related to strangulation, but it's never been discovered. It's never been discovered in looking at patterns of behavior before the incident, and it's not discovered after they've died. So there's probably a lot of people, unfortunately, in the ground who are there by some of the cause and by someone else's hands, and we don't know about it. Dr. Bill Smock, he has a very unique position. He is the doctor for the Louisville Metro Police Department. It's one of the only few police departments in the United States that actually has their own medical doctor on staff with their own clinic. And he does it for two reasons. Number one, officers that are injured in the line of duty get directly and immediately treated by him in his clinic. But he is also focused on non-fatal strangulation interventions as well. So he's got a whole forensic team and forensic room where he makes these evaluations of non-fatal strangulation. And he's, again, another one of these national and international experts who was also one of my instructors. So why do we need this information? Well, it's because of misinformation and just no information at all. When you talk to people about what's going on crime-wise, what are kind of the big hot button issues, you don't hear anything related to strangulation. No, we talk about, DUI awareness and impaired driving, and in October we talk about domestic violence, but this happens with regularity. And even though this found its foundation in domestic violence and intimate partner violence, it extends to all just about any other type of assault crime you can think of, regardless of offender victim relationship. And so the uninformed and the misinformed is something that we're having to battle. You know, I can tell you that 20 years ago, before getting the advanced training, what I was told about strangulation in the law enforcement world was look for petechial hemorrhages in the whites of their eyes and look for marks on their neck. Well, unfortunately, again, people were so locked up on the external injuries and having limited knowledge and information that if it wasn't there and the victim / survivor couldn't give you a linear story to explain what else happened, we had a tendency to discredit. And that's why a lot of people have suffered, because of our misinformation and being misinformed. So our domestic violence law specifically asks law enforcement to consider issues limited to or issues with limited air circulation. As y'all know, or some of y'all might know, the DV law changed in 2015, and the House Reform Committee, through a bill, instituted some changes which put some language in the domestic violence law relating to words of, you know, restricting or limiting air circulation, but they also gave it graduated penalties. You know, technically the way it's written, you can strangle somebody and be charged with a second-degree misdemeanor. You know, it only becomes what we call domestic violence high and aggravated. And my understanding and what I tell people is that's about as close to attempted murder as you can get as far as a charge goes. But it says restriction of air or blood flow causing loss of consciousness or stupor for any length of time. That has to be there to establish it as a DV high and aggravated. But as we go through this, and as some of you already know, you don't have to be unconscious or suffer some type of stupor from the lack of oxygen to your brain to be at risk of death later. So, but we do have a specific law that says check for these things, but do we still check for those things? And sometimes it can still be a hit and miss. So why do we have lack of awareness? Well, media exposure is low. If you look at other countries like the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada, there is a fair number of public service announcements and public service commercials that relate to domestic violence on a regular basis on prime time TV. There has become an increased emphasis specific to strangulation. So the United States, have done a pretty poor job of bringing this knowledge to the attention of the masses. Because again, it's only certain times of the year that we hear little blurbs about it. And we certainly, again, don't have any like regular public service announcements. And again, I'm all about impaired driving and DUI, but you know, sober slammer, you know, when was the last time you heard anything about non-fatal strangulation in a commercial like that, right? It just isn't there. I will tell you, I've explored the possibility of reaching out to some media groups, and they're money driven. So, you know, if you don't have the money, it's like they're not going to produce it. But safe to say, media exposure is pretty low. That's why the masses don't know about it. Little to no public education. So again, when you take media out of it and you just look at either regional or collective education opportunities, it doesn't happen all that much. That's why I'm so thankful for opportunities like this for like-minded people to sharpen their focus and their skills related to non-fatal strangulation, but also to take that level of familiarization and knowledge back to the places that you work to do training within your discipline, in your area of focus. And it truly has to be multidisciplinary. Educational systems generally have no curriculum. You know, so again, correct me if I'm wrong, but a number of years ago, I did one of my first non-fatal strangulation presentations, like in 2016. It was to South Carolina Board of Medical Examiners. You know, those are all the physicians that hold the licenses under LLR for all your doctors. And I felt a little intimidated going in there. It was like, 15 of them sitting in there, and you got 30-year neurosurgeons in there and pediatric surgeons and all the psychiatrists and all sitting in there. And I get into all this, and when I get done, they're all sitting there going, "This is the first we've ever heard of this stuff. We never had any exposure to this in medical school." And so then I was like, really? I mean, y'all asked me to come in. I thought y'all had some basis or foundation to know what I'm talking about, but y'all are all telling me this is all like new to you. And then as I've looked into different nursing programs, EMS, paramedic training, that sort of thing, they're like, kind of heard about it, but we don't really have anything. So one thing I try to do with the Criminal Justice Academy is since about 2016, we've incorporated non-fatal strangulation awareness training into basic law enforcement training. Now, with that being said, I will tell you that once they leave the academy, our ability to influence them, it becomes very limited. We have refresher classes of all kinds. I'm assigned to the advanced training unit actually. So we have refresher classes, but there needs to be constant exposure within everyone's discipline, a regular, because we all of our professions, we have people cycle in and cycle out retirement, changes in career. I tell people there's always a fresh pool of people coming in, but there's also the people that are there that just need to have, again, a reaffirmation, a retraining to stay on what I call that sharp edge of knowledge. And so most educational systems that we have do not have a formal curriculum. It is something I've talked to DHEC about, and actually the Board of Medical Examiners about getting the courses and stuff approved for physician credit and everything, but that can be a little bit of a process, but it's something we're trying to work on. And a limited number of instructors. How many of y'all know a non-fatal strangulation instructor? Yeah. Now, to be fair, I mean, especially with our forensic nurses in here, you have a lot more, practical experience and a deeper knowledge than the general public, and then more than a lot of your medical professionals. I do, again, have to toot my own horn. So I have actually been through the same program. So Sabrina Gast, some of y'all know, and Terry Casto, they ran the same program. And back in 2007, they allowed me to go through the 40-hour same course. Now, I couldn't do the practical exams because I'm not an RN, but I'm happy to say I took all the tests. I passed them with flying colors because I wanted a more deeper and intimate knowledge about that process, not just from the victim survivor side and just processing what they think about during those exams and such, but from just the collection of forensics, the law enforcement side, how it fits into the court prosecution process. So, but not everybody has that experience. And so, but as far as specific non-fatal strangulation, I've probably done about 35 or 40 since 2016 across all kind of different disciplines. And I'm the only one that I know that maybe does it on a regular basis. But again, I would not say I am the expert. I'm just a voice. I'm just a portal, if you will, to bring information to people that want it and need it. So it's extremely limited. You look at other states and everything that have developed curriculums, and I would say, and this is Brian's opinion here, I think states that have instituted an actual law that defines strangulation actually in a way forces the professions to get up to speed in acknowledgement of it. Whether it's the judiciary, the prosecutors, the medical field, everyone now has to become aware because it's a law. And so I think we're working towards that goal, but we're not there just yet. So we have a limited number of instructors, and it's usually me, which I'm happy to do. So training across disciplines. All right, so let's talk about law enforcement. I told you real briefly, we do have basic training at the academy. I do some regular advanced classes for other agencies as a request. Just to give you an idea, about 3 weeks ago, the South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services, they actually have some of their parole agents are actually DV specialists. In other words, they are DV agents, and their sole job is to monitor domestic violence offenders. So they usually have me come in every couple of years because they have like a rotation, a new crop. And so we had about 40 to 50 DV agents that took an all-day non-fatal strangulation class because they are dealing with these offenders on a regular basis. They're having to ask them questions as part of their supervision, like, have you had any contact with the victim? What type of contact have you had? They're also looking for signs, symptoms, and indicators of non-fatal strangulation behaviors in the suspect, but also maybe in the victim who might still be in the picture. So they're raising their level of awareness. So different law enforcement agencies, different entities in South Carolina do ask for some specialized training from time to time. So I'm happy to accommodate that. Victim advocates, got many of you in here. South Carolina Victims' Rights Week, which I'm at most every year. We also do the LEVAs, South Carolina Law Enforcement Victim Advocates. I'm real tied in with them. And so sometimes at their yearly conference or Victims' Rights Week, I have an opportunity to, and although it may be limited, sometimes I'm limited to an hour, but I take whatever opportunity I can get. And I neglected to say this morning that I'm going to feed you with a fire hose. So you're going to get a lot compacted into 2 hours because I want to maximize my time. So victim advocates, critical point of contact for our victim survivors. Rhetorical question, victim advocates, think about how many people may have come to you without going and filing the police report, just to come in and get information. I don't want to file a police report. I don't want to get law enforcement involved, but I need information. That could be an opportunity for an intervention, even though there isn't a quote incident report done yet, which we would obviously like to have happened, but it's not a requirement for people to come to you for help. Okay, just for information, be empowered with information. Paramedics and EMTs, same thing. No formal curriculum. I've talked to many who have started in this career, but have been in it for a while. And as the chaos that can sometimes happen in a critical event, there's a lot of things we're having to manage. Maintaining airway and bleeding and all kinds of stuff. Well, sometimes it takes someone else to tell them what they think has transpired. So I always tell everybody, and you'll hear me say it in a little bit, when your paramedics and EMTs come into a scene, if you suspect or there are indicators of strangulation, tell those paramedics and EMTs what you suspect. Doesn't mean that it's proof, but at least at that point, if their mind is kind of fragmented under, over like 10 different things they're trying to worry about, but now they realize, anoxic brain injury, maintaining airway could be compromised. They start to maybe focus a little bit more on those areas and pick up on some of their own things that could be problematic. And another big thing is just documentation. What have they documented that they may not have documented before your notification? So EMS and paramedics. Medical, obviously, probably the most prominent place is going to be in the emergency department. We know that there's a lot of domestic violence victims, and I know I'm saying domestic violence, and I'll get into the other crimes of opportunity, but a lot of domestic violence victims show up at the ER and they say they fell down the stairs, they got involved in a motor vehicle collision, had some type of accident. Sometimes the offender's there with them, sometimes not, but we know that disclosure of the reality of what happened is very problematic. And so again, raising that level of awareness within the emergency department to get that proper triage is really important. And our prosecutors, everyone in this chain is important. Every one of these individuals is an opportunity to have an interaction with someone who has been strangled. They don't always come to law enforcement right away. A lot of times they go to their friends and their family first. It is not unusual for victims not to report to law enforcement and call their friends or family first, or go to the CVS Minute Clinic. I don't know, the emergency department, you name it. But we all have an opportunity for interaction and information and showing concern and giving advisements. And so if any of us fail in this chain, it's not us there's an indirect risk, but it's not us that's under direct risk. It's the victim survivor that just went through this direct risk if we don't take that opportunity of intervention to empower them. And when it comes to prosecutors, I will tell you that there are some prosecutors that are really, really good. All prosecutors coming out of law school, they know the standards of prosecuting a case, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, different types of evidence, testimonial evidence, documentary evidence. There's all kinds of different types of evidence, some which may be available, some which may not be available. But when it comes to documentation is absolutely critical to a prosecutor. But then beyond that, they might have the documentation, but do they know how to effectively prosecute the strangulation case? Some do and some don't. And it really is case specific. I've talked to some prosecutors who had a much more intimate knowledge of strangulation, the signs and symptoms and effects, and what experts to call versus, another who was like, I don't even know where to start, and particularly, and some of y'all will know this, when it comes to intimate partner violence and strangulation, the defense said it was a consensual act. The strangulation was part of some, sex act that heightened the euphoria, and it was consensual. A lot of prosecutors don't know how to battle that. There's courses out there for them to take to counteract the consent defense. And it actually is a pretty easy case to make, but they haven't had the exposure. So we bring in all these trainings to all these disciplines so that we don't drop the ball. That's what I hope, we don't drop the ball. So what do you bring to the table? That's a rhetorical question. What in your mind, with your responsibility and your disciplines, can you do to bring information to the table? Because we're all part of this puzzle. And hopefully one day we might have like a family justice center where everybody's on the same board, same table, same train of thought, and have and rather than the standalone entity, we have 4, 5, 6 entities all building towards the same thing and a collective effort. And that's what I would love to see one day. So, types of assault crimes. Well, obviously, again, the foundations of non-fatal strangulation started in domestic violence, but we know that sexual assaults, aggravated sexual assaults, is a component where strangulation is used because not a lot of force is necessary to subdue and render your victim incapable of defending themselves or even remembering the event at all. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Child abuse. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, I did a pediatric strangulation presentation for the South Carolina Association of School Nurses. And there was about, I want to say about 300 or 400 people there. They were not all school nurses, but there were some administrators, principals, some other support staff there. But I can tell you after that presentation, and again, I'm not a clinician, but using the research out there and the data out there, some of y'all know the name Kim Nash. She's one of the national experts. She did a lot of work in that area. Those school nurses, a lot of them came up to me and they had that same epiphany that I had in that advanced course, back in 20. They're like, oh God, I can remember things. I remember this kid. I remember things that they said. I remember things that they did. I remember seeing these behaviors. I remember seeing these things on their body and I didn't get it. And they would be like, I don't know if it was strangulation, but now I'm going, it likely was. And I don't want to be in that position again. So with children, we see that happen at school, okay, between school age kids. I'm not going to get into the choking game, but y'all know what I'm talking about. Kids doing this choking game and everything like that. But I'm talking about more so the assaults among students. I went to high school. I got in fights on the playground. I know sometimes we settled our fights in the bathroom. Well, there's a lot of things that are done outside the view of the teachers and the administration. There's a lot of hiding places and a lot of cubby holes on a school campus for really, really bad things to happen. So that's an aspect I'm talking about as far as child abuse goes, but also, parents as well. It's sad I'm not going to show it here today, but I got videos of parents strangling their children to get back at the spouse that they're divorcing from. Using those kids not just as a pawn figuratively, but actually, and it's some really terrible things to see a parent would do that to a child. And imagine that kid's going to school, getting on the school bus every day, interacting with teachers and everything, and this kind of stuff's going on at home. It's really terrible stuff. Vulnerable adults, one of my passions too. I tell everybody, if and I'm sharing a little bit of my faith here, if the Lord so allows me to live long enough and I don't die by some traumatic event or spontaneous event, I will be a vulnerable adult one day, and you will too. Might be the last 5 minutes of your life, last 5 weeks, 5 days, 5 months, 5 years, but there will come a time if you live long enough that somebody will be doing something for you that you can't do for yourself, which makes you a vulnerable adult if you're over the age of 18. Well, these vulnerable adults, they're not the easiest to deal with. I get it. We know caregiver stress is a reality, but it's not an excuse for any type of abuse or assault. It is reality. It's tough. But for them having, pillows put over their face and, again, strangled with bed sheets and all kind of positional type stuff that can go on, they're at risk too. Okay. Kidnappings. There's a lady, she would not mind me sharing her name. Her name's Karen Ho. She is like the head victim advocate for the South Carolina Department of Corrections. And you would say, why does the Department of Corrections need a victim advocate? Well, all those criminals are in there for a reason. And there's follow-up that has to be done with victims even after people are incarcerated. But guess what? You also have staff who are victims of crimes from the inmates. Staff are assaulted. Staff have been sexually assaulted, physically assaulted, threatened, harassed, stalked. But unique to her is that she was an actual victim of a daytime broad noon kidnapping when she was 17 years old. She got kidnapped by a serial rapist who raped her and violently assaulted her and strangled her multiple times during that. She's probably in her mid-50s now. She is still suffering the ill effects of that strangulation to this day. These many years later, she has vision problems. She has problems maintaining her airway. She's had a couple surgeries where she almost died on the operating table, and the anesthesiologist could not maintain the airway. And it wasn't until probably, 15, 20 years after she had been kidnapped and sexually assaulted that she started to find out information about strangulation, and things started to connect back with her doctors and her specialists and her neurologist, that things were probably connected to that event years ago. And so it happens with kidnappings as well. Robberies, okay? Not every robber uses a gun. Threatened use of force can be enough for a strong arm robbery or considered an armed robbery. I can stick my hand in my pocket, I use my finger, and you think I've got a gun. That's enough to be charged with an armed robbery. It's not what I have, it's what victim thought that I had. Well, when I'm using perhaps my body, my size, my threats, and now to my hands or a ligature to subdue, control the robbery victim, happens there as well. And then, of course, with human trafficking as well. I was talking to some of y'all before class. Human trafficking, we know it's a big problem in South Carolina, Southeast United States, and the southern border probably is the biggest pathways. We know Atlanta's a big hub for that sort of thing, going north and south and east and west. And if you think about it, your human trafficking victims, they are a human commodity. Sex trade, indentured servitude, you name it, they're under a lot of threats. Well, some of those threats are they were strangled, or they're threatened to be strangled. And if I don't strangle you, I'm going to strangle the other person who's in the human trafficking with you. So if you don't do it for your own good, you're going to do it to save your friend who's next to you. And these individuals that are being human trafficked, usually females predominantly, could be children as well, could be men as well. They're put out to be the commodity, and no one knows. They don't see any external signs and symptoms of injury. That human commodity is out there seemingly undamaged, but they are damaged physically, psychologically, emotionally. So it spreads very, very far. A woman who survives one strangulation event is 750 more times likely to be strangled again and 800% more likely to be killed later. That comes from the Institute on Strangulation Prevention, from some research that they've done. It was 700%, but a couple years ago it went up to 750% as far as being strangled again. 800% more likely to be killed later. And it's not death by strangulation. It is usually death by firearm. So the rates say about 70 to 77%. Stats always change, but on average, 70 to 77% is death by firearm. But in a lot of those cases, the number one indicator of future homicide was the strangulation. Non-fatal strangulation is still the number one indicator of future homicide. I say, well, yeah, future homicide, that makes sense. Yeah, but we're being too narrow-minded when we say homicide. Where does our mind usually go first? The victim, the direct victim of the strangulation or the intimate partner violence. But what we know from more research and some time for a full day class is that some of your homicide victims are what we call the collateral damage. The friends and family members that were around or are around that intimate partner were the ones that were killed. I always tell people, if you're willing to harm or kill your intimate partner, you're willing to harm or kill anybody, including yourself. A lot of times we see these offenders do the whole, homicide suicide thing. Again, if you can kill somebody else, you can kill yourself pretty easy. You can justify that. But children, women, friends, family that have tried to intervene, that happen to be there at the moment, are law enforcement officers. Our law enforcement officers are at risk, higher risk of being killed in the line of duty, dealing with any offender. We say domestic violence offenders are some of the most dangerous people to deal with. Yes, absolutely. But you have a domestic violence intimate partner violence offender, that exponentially increases the danger to law enforcement when they go to intervene against that individual. So a lot of police officers, I got to do is look it up. A lot of police officers in this country have been killed in domestic violence incidents. Now, I will say this: when Governor Haley had me as co-chairman of her law enforcement division of her domestic violence task force, South Carolina doesn't keep really good records. Our systems in South Carolina are very disjointed. They don't communicate well with each other because of different platforms and different software, where other states who've addressed this issue, 10, 15 years ago have systems that all tie into each other with the appropriate safeguards in place, for HIPAA and stuff like that. But there are systems out there that law enforcement could run, or social services could run, or hospital systems, and it would show all these connections across all these different disciplines. Well, we don't have that. But if you look at our South Carolina law enforcement officers who've been feloniously killed in the line of duty, the overwhelming majority is with domestic violence offenders who ambush the officers. Now, national research would tell us that the majority of those offenders had a history of strangling their intimate partners. We can't definitively say that in South Carolina because we don't keep good records. When I say we, I mean collectively we. It's not just law enforcement, it's the courts, it's all of the processes in between and intermingled that we don't have a good way to track. But again, if you look at what national research is showing, then it would tend to tell us there was probably some non-fatal strangulation events in that person's past to get the offender to that kind of mindset. Strangulation, number one indicator, future homicide. All right, so some realities of strangulation. This came from the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. Only 3% of victims seek medical attention. This is what I tell my officers: if suspecting strangulation, be sure to call EMS and advise them of your concerns in spite of victim reluctance or refusal. We know, and y'all know, that we cannot force crime victims to go to the hospital. We simply try to inform them. When it comes to non-fatal strangulation, I'm real big about telling the victim at what risk they are, how they're at risk, what are the realities of not being triaged with their long-term health, their immediate health. And I tell people, I don't intentionally scare victims. What I do is I tell law enforcement officers that victim needs to see such a concern in you that they're concerned for their own welfare. If I'm looking at a victim who I believe has been strangled, and I'm looking to go, sir, ma'am, things are telling me that you likely were, strangled. And we know that without proper medical intervention or triage, you may suffer some really serious injuries immediately or in the near future or weeks down the road. I'm very concerned for your safety. Let's get you to the hospital. If they see concern in the law enforcement officer and they go, hopefully that little light bulb, God, they know something that I don't. They're that concerned and worried for me that they're scared. Maybe I need to internalize this a little bit and get there. So going back to what I said earlier, we tell law enforcement, still call for your paramedics, your EMTs. Tell those paramedic or EMTs what you think has occurred. I think they've been strangled. Hopefully that paramedic or EMT can focus a little bit more on that head and neck area and, issues of anoxic brain injury and maintaining airways and vascular structures in the neck. We may not get the victim to the hospital like we want, but at least we have an opportunity to have another medical professional come in. I know paramedics and EMTs, they're not diagnosing, they're triaging and stabilizing. But if we get them trained and we're giving some advisements and everything, and they can have another conversation with that strangulation victim, then we have a better opportunity to get that emergency room triage that we need. So I call paramedics anyway. All right. So let me give you some perspectives here. All right. Now, this is going to be like a little scenario I want you to play in your head. And this is where I'm going to give you my examples that I give that express what Gail Strack said earlier. Like, we tend to minimize it. We don't get it. I share these couple ideas with everybody that I talk to, and the light bulb seems to go off. I was sitting in my office one day and I was thinking of this scenario, and I love doing this one for the prosecutors. I'll say, okay, so let's imagine the scenario. You're walking down a sidewalk and someone on the other side of the street pulls out a pistol, points it at your direction, and starts firing off some bullets. And we'll stipulate that you were not hit by any bullet. There is no physical injury to you whatsoever. What could the person be charged with? Some people say attempted murder. Some people say, assault and battery high and aggravated, any number of things. But all of them are kind of agreed. High-level felony, serious stuff. And I remind them, okay, now remember, you didn't get hit by any bullet. Person didn't get hit by a bullet. There's no physical injury whatsoever. It might be a traumatic experience that the psyche has to deal with, but no physical injury. I say, but is this more or less serious than getting shot at? And see a couple people sit there and go, should be an easy question for people that know. It's as serious or more serious. Reason being is because this person has another person's hands or a ligature around their neck in an attempt to deprive their brain of the necessary oxygen to stay alive. And I'm like, over here, the person over here, victim over here, never got shot, no physical injury whatsoever, but the potential for great bodily injury or death here is so much higher than over here. So why do we make this such a minimal issue? And to kind of add that next little kind of exclamation point, I tell people, hey, if somebody was strangling you, if somebody was trying to put their hands or a ligature around your neck, would you have the lawful authority to use lethal force against that person to save your life? And without fail, they go, oh, yeah, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. If they were doing that, oh, yeah, I'd kill them in a heartbeat. I'm like, okay, then how come when we get cases like this, they're not charged as serious? If you're telling me that if you were that victim, it'd be so serious that you would use lethal force and be authorized under law to use lethal force to save your life, then how is it any less for anybody else that went through it? And that's where you sometimes see that little light bulb go off. Now, I'm going to say something else too, and this is just a matter of the law, okay? The law enforcement reform bill was passed last year. It went into effect back in January. If you look at the law enforcement reform bill, at the very last, one of the last sections, it says that law enforcement officers are prohibited from using chokeholds or neck restraints unless it constitutes use of lethal force. In other words, you can't use it to control somebody. You can only use it because there's a lethal force necessary to use it. Well, if a law enforcement officer can't use it unless it meets deadly force, then how is it different for anybody else? That tells us how serious it is. Okay? So now we get into the meat and potatoes here. Strangulation is a form of asphyxiation characterized by external pressure on the veins and arteries of the neck or something thereabouts. That's, it doesn't have to be exact, but if you understand external pressure on the veins, arteries, and airways of the neck, and it's depriving the brain primarily, but the body from the necessary oxygen, that's your strangulation. Now, we have other forms of asphyxiation, right? Drowning is one of them. Suffocation. This is with respect to strangulation, the mechanism, okay? But we know that positional asphyxia, that's something we also see. Offenders sitting on the victim's chest or sitting on their back, twisting them up into a pretzel where they can't expand their diaphragm and their breathing. So there's lots of different ways which oxygen can be limited to the brains. With respect here, we're talking about external pressure on these structures of the neck, head and neck. Okay, so we got ligature and we got manual, two basic forms. Ligature, y'all, you pick whatever inanimate object you want to. I think people understand. It's more of a uh, maybe common sense for some, not common sense for others, but commonly what we see is rope, shoelaces, cords, necklace, anything that's not part of the body. We see with sexual assault sometimes it's the victim's own shirt, their brassiere. Y'all might remember. Y'all may or may not know, but the first year that the non-fatal strangulation bill was written, it was named in the memory of Emily Anna Asbel from up in the Lawrence County area. She was strangled in the front seat of her car to death by her on again, off again boyfriend. She was strangled to death with a USB power cord from her cell phone. We see coax cables from the cable television, all kinds of stuff being used, necklaces. They sometimes leave patterns, not always, but sometimes they leave patterns because of that ligature provides a lot of focused compression in a small area. And so sometimes we see these pattern injuries related to the ligature that was used. More commonly, when you talk to people and they say someone's been strangled, they commonly think of the manual. What do you think the visual image of the manual? What do you think pops up in their head? What image? A frontal strangulation using two hands. That's usually what they think of. That's how strangulation happens. Well, it depends. It depends. It's all case specific. Thinking of cases that I've had familiarity to come across or consult on or whatever. I mean, we've had strangulations from the front, from the side, from behind, one hand, two hand. We've had a victim laying down, suspect standing up, suspect laying down, victim standing up. Every make and model of position you can think of, and all kind of parts of the human body being used. Normally the hands and the forearms and the arms, but I mean, you look at any type of mixed martial arts fighting and they got scissor locks with their legs and they got the victim's head between their legs and they're cranking down, all manner of things. And that's why I tell our law enforcement officers, when it comes to strangulation, you need to have an intimate understanding of the positions of both the victim and the suspect. Their positioning relative to each other can give you some insight onto, what mechanism or how it was done. If they're, as one, they were both laying down and one's head was that way and one head was that way, or was the suspect directly behind the victim so close that they were touching chest to back and there was a forearm around the neck. I mean, that's the level of detail that's not just needed by law enforcement, but also in the medical field as well, to figure out where that compression was focused, how broad or how narrow, what structures of the head and neck could have been affected by that particular mechanism that was used. So this is just, your basic anatomy. It comes from the gross anatomy book and everything. I'm just pointing this as these are the basic structures. And again, we're keeping it real basic here because I know we got a diverse experience. So we're going from the lowest common denominator to the highest, rather from don't know anything all the way to, high levels of medical training. But we're looking at these structures. I will point out this, I had to practice this word a lot, sternocleidomastoid muscle. Right here, attached to the top of the collarbone, goes there behind that little bony prominence behind the ear. Sometimes that's where some of our bruises show up from that connective tissue being torn or tension during the strangulation. So three main structures we're looking at is the carotid artery, the jugular vein, and the trachea, obviously, with our carotid artery bringing that oxygenated blood into the brain. Quiz for you. How much oxygen does the brain need percentage-wise to stay functioning normally? Any ideas? 20%. 20% of the body's oxygen on average is what the brain needs to function properly. When the brain drops below 20%, it doesn't like it. The brain does not like to have its needed oxygen. So the moment it starts dropping, the brain is really good about detecting that, and different changes and different thoughts and all kind of stuff starts happening in that person's body, whether they realize it or not, when that oxygen level drops. So that oxygenated blood coming from the heart and the lungs, going up through the carotid artery, obviously the deoxygenated blood that the oxygen is used up, within seconds going into the brain, comes out through our jugular vein back into our heart and lungs. And then obviously what puts the oxygen into our bloodstream is coming by way of our trachea, and that whole circulatory system process operating over and over again. And again, when things are out of whack, the body doesn't like it. So looking at these structures, I put this image up there. I had another one that wasn't quite as detailed as I wanted. So I'm actually glad that it came out as bright and as clear as what we have there. So pathways to unconscious, lack of oxygen to the brain, we got the carotid arteries. So here's our carotid arteries right here. All right, here's our jugular veins. And then, of course, up there at the front, we got our trachea and our esophagus, obviously right next to each other there. And so those are the main structures that we're looking at, but I also want you to pay attention to the structures of our spinal column back here. And we got our vertebral arteries back here as well. And those can be affected too, not as frequent as the structures towards the front from that anterior pressure to the posterior pressure, but those can be damaged as well. A lot of people want to focus on the jugular vein, the carotid artery, but those vertebral arteries is where we get some of our strokes as well. So occlusion, in other words, a fancy word that just means the closing off or the restricting of the carotid arteries or the jugular vein, and occlusion of the airway, so pressure, which collapses the trachea. And the interesting thing about this, and as again, some of y'all know, is that depending on the mechanism of strangulation, how it was done and where the pressure was applied, it may be one of those structures or a collection of all those structures which may be affected. Okay. Some of y'all may remember that in NYPD, there was the Eric Garner case. This is where a gentleman named Eric Garner was on the sidewalk selling bootleg cigarettes. And a NYPD task force that was doing street level crime suppression had confronted him. And I guess they were going to cite him and arrest him, and there began a struggle. And one of the officers jumped on his back. He was a fairly large man. There was like 4 officers on top of him. And during the event, which was recorded, y'all might remember, he was saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." How many of y'all remember that? Okay. Now, people say, well, he's saying he can't breathe, but he's got to be breathing. He's talking. And where that's coming from is it wasn't his trachea that was occluded. He was able to breathe. He was able to actually pretty forcefully project his voice, "I can't breathe." What was happening was he was in a lateral vascular neck restraint. That's one of those law enforcement holds that is designed to compress the carotid arteries in the jugular vein, limiting blood flow to the brain, which would render him unconscious. So I told y'all, when the brain doesn't have its needed oxygen, it starts going into panic mode. So he was breathing, but his brain was registering, "I don't have enough oxygen. I don't have enough oxygen." That's why he felt like he couldn't breathe. He didn't feel like he was getting enough oxygen because of the way his brain was responding to the drop in oxygen. But as an example, you can see where in some instances, knowing how someone was strangled, it might have been the trachea that was occluded. It might have been the carotid artery or the jugular vein or any combination thereof, any of which could reduce that oxygenated blood to the brain. We're going to get into pressures here in just a minute. So now I've seen some different numbers when it comes to pressure. So these are averages. There's been more specific training, but they've all basically been around the same number. I don't know if there's I think most of the literature that you look at says a lot of it has to do with how big someone's neck is, the muscle that protects that area, size, duration, pressure. It all has some variations dependent upon the mechanism of strangulation, but also the medical physiological makeup of a person's body as well. But these are some good numbers. So your jugular vein occlusion, about 4.5 pounds of pressure for about 10 seconds can lead to unconsciousness. This came from the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. And about 11 pounds of pressure on the carotid artery. Now you see it says anterior. So we're talking about the pressure from the front towards the back. This, now, if you look at some other studies out there, Dr. William Green out of California, who's a emergency room doctor and a strangulation specialist and everything, some of his literature points to a larger number of 22 pounds of pressure. But when we're considering anterior pressure, so from the front to the back, what contributes to this lower number is the compression of this carotid artery against the spinal structure in the neck. There's basically, a hard wall there, and it's easier to occlude something when you have a hard wall on the back side, rather than just, loose or flexible tissue all the way around. So from front to back, and these structures are being compressed in this area where our spinal column and our spinal structure is, it closes it with less pressure. All right. So that's where you get some of the numbers from. Trachea, about 33 pounds of pressure to, the trachea is very flexible. I have, not in strangulation, but I've motor vehicle collisions. They've been ruptured tracheas. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law passed away from a ruptured trachea during a medical exam. So it can happen. It's not the most delicate thing in the world, but it is delicate to some degree. And, we got the hyoid bone up here at the top. There's some literature out there that says that the hyoid bone will be fractured. That's a lot of times what you see in the movies. Like you watch what's that NBC show, Law and Order, SVU. They have a lot of, it's like every time they have a strangulation, the hyoid bone's fractured. They've been strangled. Well, not always, but it's that one little bone in the body that's not connected to any other bone. It's kind of floating around there. It can be fractured. Last literature I saw was about 60 pounds of pressure to fracture that, but that's not an absolute. But going more down here to your laryngeal cartridge and everything, your trachea down here is, you'll have to know that the laryngeal cartridge can be fractured as well, but about 33 pounds of pressure. It's not a whole lot. Pulling the trigger on a pistol, law enforcement, 6 pounds of pressure, not a lot. 6 pounds of pressure takes somebody's life. It's not a lot. Opening a can of soda, that's what blew my mind. 20 pounds of pressure per square inch to open a can of soda. Right? I open like 15 of those a day. I have big muscles, strong muscles in my finger. No. So hopefully not drinking that much soda. Anyway, but yeah, 20 pounds of pressure, and the average adult male handshake is 80 to 100 PSI. But we don't make, it doesn't make sense if we do that and we're like, that doesn't seem like 80 to 100. But it can. All has to do with in duration and, where the pressure is focused. Because, I would say probably, and just talking to Dr. Smock, who actually did a lot of this research, it's because that those pounds of pressure per square inch are spread out over a larger area than a focused area. If I took 80 to 100 pounds of pressure in one little area and pressed it into your hand, you'd probably be like, I can feel that. But spread over a larger surface area, maybe less acknowledgement of how much pressure that is. Some of the strongest that they've measured was 160 to 180. That's just one hand, and that's not a whole lot. So when you look at these, y'all, we carry groceries from our car to our front door that weigh more than what it takes to strangle somebody with. If y'all like me, I'm carrying 15 bags of groceries because I don't want to go back to the car 5 times, right? We've all been there. So some other terminology that you see is the hypoxia, the deficiency in the amount of oxygen reaching the tissues, and anoxia, absence of oxygen reaching the tissues. And the most prominent organ in our body that's going to be that's not going to like that lack of oxygen is going to be the brain. Now, where this 2 minutes or less comes from, and actually I pulled it off of another slide just in the interest of time. The Institute on Strangulation Prevention at one time put 4 minutes as likely death. 4 minutes without oxygen, you're absolutely dead as a doornail. That number changed to 2 minutes or less because of research that obviously showed some variations with particular to the physiology of the victims, and then specifics more known about pressure, duration, mechanism. So 2 minutes or less. And so this 32,000 neurons, what does that mean? 32,000 neurons die every second that you're unconscious. And 230 million synapses destroyed every second that someone's unconscious. I try to bring this reality home to people who don't understand the progression that can have. So usually in my law enforcement groups, I usually ask a question that's not a rhetorical question. I actually want a response. And I'll say, hey, how many of y'all have done or do mixed martial arts fighting? And there's usually a fair number that, okay, I do it. And I'm like, okay, we get into a discussion. And, do you do that because of defense or self-defense or just wanting to be fit. And there's always variations, well, I'm in law enforcement. I need to defend myself and take care of myself. Some people, it's just, I like the cardiovascular workout. And so then I'll ask them, I'll say, okay, how many of y'all have ever been unconscious during your mixed martial arts training or during a mixed martial arts fight? And raise your hand. And almost without fail, every one of them that said they do that was like, oh yeah, I've been there. They call it the rear naked choke is one of the positions, or they call it. You watch any MMA and they'll, Jimmy John's got Billy in the rear naked choke. He's going to be out in a few seconds. It's just a term they use to describe physically what's going on. Okay. And I just went unconscious. Everything got dark real quick. So then I ask them to say, okay, how many of y'all have been unconscious 5 times? Keep your hand up. 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. Highest I ever got was a guy that was over 70. He'd been doing mixed martial arts fighting for over 40 years. And I said, okay, I want you to think about something. And I popped this little thing up. I said, every time you've been unconscious, for every second you've been unconscious, that's the amount of damage on average that has occurred to your brain. And they're like, brain damage? I'm brain damaged? And I'm like, yeah. Now, obviously, you're able to talk and walk and do all this other great stuff, but there could be some real problems later. This progressive damage comes at a cost. If it comes at a cost during sanctioned and mutual training environments, then we know that this damage occurs in the criminal assault world to the same degree. This progressive injury, this progressive brain damage. And I think that's pretty scary to me. That's pretty scary to me. And I think the reality of that should be pretty scary to anyone else who's ever been unconscious as a result of one of these strangulation events, because it really starts to affect quality of life. Maybe quicker for some than others, but there's damage for sure. So how do we suspect that strangulation is going on? Well, we do have some physical indicators. I mean, there are going to be times where people are going to have the bumps, bruises, abrasions, around their head and neck area. And we see things within the law enforcement realm. I tell people always still consider looking for those external injuries. Are they there a lot of times? No, but still look. Be mindful of how people are positioned around you. This doesn't go just for law enforcement officers. This goes for any of y'all who may encounter a victim survivor who is trying to cover up these injuries. I'll never forget, I'm kind of showing my age. I turned 50 a couple weeks ago. I remember there was an episode of the Bill Cosby Show, and Theo had gotten an earring, and he didn't want his dad to find out. So Theo's sitting on the bed. He's got an earring in his left ear. Dad comes in from the bedroom door on the right. And his dad has gotten some indication that he's got this earring, and he's waiting for Theo to disclose it. And so every time Bill Cosby walks around, Theo's body position changes. Things that would normally be natural become very unnatural. Instead of him getting up and turning, he's like walking like this, with the right side towards his dad the whole time. And every time his dad moves on our victim survivors do the same thing. They will blade their body. They'll pull hair in front of their face and neck. They'll wear clothing that comes way up. So they do all these. And I think the skill, and this again, Brian just talking for a minute, I think the skill of understanding nonverbal behavior is becoming a lost skill. I'm going to go on my soapbox just for a second if y'all indulge me. This right here has damaged the understanding of nonverbal body language. For our younger populations, they're so locked into this and this being the end all be all of communication, they can be looking right at you and not see anything that your body's saying. Whether it's aggressive stances, avoidance, and we have to become aware of this nonverbal body language with our victim survivors of strangulation, particularly when they recognize themselves. There's physical indicators that even they see and recognize. Those red dots in my eyes. I'm looking in the mirror. I better wear some shades when I go down there. or those closed or whatever it is. So we may see some physical indicators, scrapes, bumps, abrasions, abrasions, pulled out hair, busted lips, petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, on the surface of the skin, something like that. Sometimes it's just a natural curiosity. And when I say we suspect strangulation, I'm talking about with respect to your discipline. When you have those moments to interact with these strangulation victim survivors, they may not even be coming to you for that. But your natural curiosity to be involved with someone and engage with someone on a more personal, intimate level, you hear things they say, which could be coded language, just like body language. You see some body language, you hear some coded language. Maybe you see things with a better specificity or better understanding than they ever did. So you pick up on some things that they've missed. And that natural curiosity of yours goes, some things aren't adding up here. Or I've got a concern. There's a little matrix that I came up with, and I don't know if I just came up with this in my head one day or if I read some literature, but it's something that I use around the academy all the time. I have little posters up all over the place. Everything starts with observation. Everything. Observation leads to suspicion. Suspicion leads to questions. Questions lead to answers. But if you're not observant, you won't know the questions to ask. If you don't know the questions to ask, you will get no clarity. No clarity means no understanding. Everything starts with observation. So when we observe all these things that I've talked about and we develop a suspicion or a curiosity, the only way to settle that in your mind is to start asking questions. Now, you may not get the answer that you want. It may not be the most clear answer, but you're now starting to try to set those suspicions at ease with an understanding. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I always say ask. And this is something I use in the law enforcement field. As law enforcement officers, I get paid to be lawfully nosy. People pay me to stick my nose into people's personal business when I have reason to do so. Think about that in your own profession and what your roles and responsibilities are. You paid to be that nosy. I love that part of my job. I get paid to stalk stalkers and harass harassers. Really, criminal investigations, I'm going to find you. I'm going to find you just like you've been finding your victims. So natural curiosity, direct disclosure. They know something's wrong. They don't know what's wrong. And they tell you, there's something wrong going on here. I don't know what it is, but I've got a problem. Some of them may be more articulate or have a better understanding or gotten some training or some friend shared some information with them and they tell you direct disclosure that, hey, I was choked the other day and I've been having a problem remembering things. And sometimes when I drink water, I get choked up. It goes down the wrong way. And I don't know why. I'm consciously thinking to drink the water and just my throat's not working right. So they tell you some things. And then again, proper questioning, which is always I can do hours and hours on interviews and interrogations, not just in the criminal justice field, but just how to frame questions more correctly. What I call questions and good questions. In the law enforcement area, questions like, hey, did he hit you? That's a question, but that's a bad question. It's a leading question. It's one that suggests an answer and it's very closed-ended. It doesn't give me detail. Tell people, if you ever think of a question that you want to ask and you don't know how to ask it, put the word explain in front of it. Not will you explain, because that's still yes or no. It shuts you down. Explain to me how you got that patch of hair missing that I saw that's missing out the back. You got a lot of hair missing back there. Explain to me why your voice seems to be raspy or why you can't project yourself very well. So there's a difference between questions and good questions. So proper questioning is super, super important. And again, I want y'all to think about with respect to your discipline and your area of responsibility, what you can ask, maybe what you should ask, what you're allowed to ask, all has to kind of be part of that for yourself. with respect to your agency and what your responsibilities are. Behavioral changes. Obviously, we look at people's nonverbal behavior, but we also sometimes have a baseline of someone's personality because of prior interactions. And so this is where sometimes you see relatives of the individual talk about how, they used to be very clear-minded, thought very analytically, always thought processes out, was very even-keeled with their emotions. Now they seem very disjointed, displaced in time. They can't formulate sentences. Things are real choppy. They've got really, they're very abrasive. Sometimes they can be very anxious at times. And then people are like, but they never were like that before. What has happened? And sometimes it's not just the trauma of what they've been through. You get into the psychology of trauma. That's a whole science in itself. And I could talk for days about trauma-informed interviewing and how the brain works. So trauma is part of it, but also the progressive brain damage that we talked about is also part of someone's personality or psyche and how their brain works as well. So it can be a collection of things. So some questioning, what do you remember? What was said? Again, this is very, very abbreviated. Did anybody attend the training up at Francis Marion University about 3 or 4 months back with the forensic nurses up there and the trauma-informed interviewing? They had a regional training, a phenomenal blocks of instruction on neuropathology and just how the brain works with just trauma, but also strangulation and stuff, which was great. And just, again, very, very abbreviated. There's lots of training out there on that, but these are not the end all be all questions, but things about, well, what happened? They may not know what happened. It's better to focus on what do they remember. Well, if you know anything about trauma-informed interviewing, it's not always about the brain and the psyche due to how we go into our primal survival instincts in our brain and the amount of hormones and stimulating hormones that are dumped into our bodies when we go through a traumatic event does affect how the brain survival mechanism works. Okay. And sometimes they don't remember the details. Oftentimes they don't, but they remember other things that connect them to the details. Like they'll remember smells. They'll remember sensation. They'll remember touch. They'll remember sounds. Now I tell people it's like, just as an example, you might be able to walk through a grocery store and smell that fresh baked apple pie, but it takes you back to 35 years ago when your grandmother was making it fresh in the kitchen, and it attaches you to that memory. Well, a lot of times for our victim strangulation survivors, they don't remember the details of the event. They just remember little blurbs of sensory things. But those sensory points, as I call it, then connect to experiences, then connect to details. So sometimes we have a tendency to operate in the wrong direction. Want to handle some of the detail. We got to kind of work backwards sometimes. So what do they remember? What was said? And what about that I like with related to law enforcement is, can we upgrade charges to, if it's one thing for me to act, but if my words that accompany my action show a different intent, okay, they're strangling somebody. Well, can you remember anything that the offender said? Yeah, you're going to die today, bitch. Oh, wow. Okay, your actions were telling me something, but the words that were relayed by the offender also kind of show intent in a very strong way. What was done? What did you see? We know that there can be some different visual experiences with their strangulation victims because of the way the brain and the optic nerve is all connected to each other. There's been a little bit of debate on this as far as what visual experiences your victim survivors of strangulation go through. Some of them relate to just kind of seeing stars, zip around. It's kind of like, sometimes you might be out in the garden or tying your shoes and you stand up and see little stars zip around. Some of them relate to that. Some of them relate to loss of color. Everything goes to kind of monochrome, black and white and grays. Some relate to loss of peripheral vision, and then obviously the complete blackout. So there's some variations out there, but to the point of it is, each of those individuals may relate their own experience of their visual experiences. not necessarily visual, and I know what was going on and somebody was coming at me, but just the changes in vision might be able to tell us some things. One that I really like is in the law enforcement realm is what were you thinking about? And again, most of them will relate to a certain series of thoughts that happen very, very quickly within seconds. Not even, it can happen in a matter of a second or two, but some of your, and I'm going to kind of tap into my own experiences with interviewing strangulation victims and asking them what they're thinking about. You know, one is kind of like, okay, is this really happening? They almost like, is this a dream? They have this question of reality. Is this really happening? Then it's the recognition, it is happening. And then the decision of what do I do, which could be the fight or flight or freeze, you know, that primal part of our brain kicks in. And then when things aren't working, because we have had victims like, I pretended to play dead. I just went limp. And because they thought, I guess they thought they killed me or I was unconscious, they were like, and they let me go. Others, you know, fighting with everything they could, kicking and scratching, biting, you name it. But when things are not working, they usually have this resignation. This is the end. And a lot of them don't think about themselves. They think about the people they're going to leave behind. They're thinking about things that they were not able to do. Like I wasn't able to talk to my son for the last time, my daughter, my husband, my wife, my whatever. I wasn't able to have this interaction. So a lot of times it becomes less about themselves and about other people that they think they're getting ready to leave behind. So I think their experiences are really, really important. Another question I like is how did it stop? You know, now that's, I wouldn't ask it that way. Well, how did it stop? But to consider that form of a question, I'm curious to know how it stopped. Again, maybe they played dead. Maybe I've had victims for the little bit of breath they were able to get out is if you kill me, you're going to go to jail. Or I'm going to end up at the hospital and they're going to ask me what happened and you're going to, you know, somebody's going to find out what you did. So all kind of things can be said or done, which leads to how the event stopped. And that could relate to, you know, things that the victim did, things that the victim said, maybe outside third parties acting in benefit of the victim that caused the assault or the strangulation to stop. Now, obviously, this becomes very, very problematic with vulnerable adults or children who are nonverbal. That's why I'm really, really big about making sure that our children, our vulnerable adults, get the appropriate attention they need because they may not be able to tell you what's going on. They can't relate to you and articulate their thoughts, their feelings, and their experiences, even under the best of circumstances. So really, I mean, I got a soft spot for everybody with strangulation, but particularly with the children and the vulnerable adults because of that potential to be nonverbal. So behavior and psychological changes that we see from time to time is in the short term, shock, disbelief, hysteria, anger, and crying. I overemphasize purposefully with our law enforcement officers, don't have it in your mind that a victim's going to respond a certain way, that all victims are crying. I mean, some are crying, some are distraught, some of them are neutral, they're unfeeling, they're zoned out, some of them are angry and upset, want to fight. And certainly if you think about being strangled to the point of unconsciousness and fighting for your life and you go unconscious, a lot of times you wake up doing the same thing because your brain's next conscious thought was, I'm still being attacked, I need to defend myself. So we've had police officers go over and try to revive somebody, get punched in the face. You know, you okay? Bam. You know, it's like they didn't do it on purpose. Their next conscious thought was they're still in the throes of a self-protection. Long-term, PTSD. How many of y'all have seen that transition to PTSI? Post-traumatic stress injury. There's starting to be a shift in that terminology because post-traumatic stress disorder kind of has set a kind of negative connotation. So PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury, is starting to get some feet now as a different term that still refers to the same thing, but a different connotation. Because we obviously know that a lot of people that are experiencing post-traumatic stress didn't go out and look for that stress. You know, it's not that they had a disorder to go out and look for it. Hey, I want to be abused. I want to be neglected. No, it was things that were brought to them and they suffered an injury as a result of it. Sleep problems, depression, suicidal ideations, memory deficits, obviously with the brain, we're getting ready to touch on that as we start to wrap things up. But so I always tell people there's a short term and a long term. And obviously, law enforcement officers, we're not clinicians, we're not psychologists or psychotherapists, but mental health and interventions are just as important as the medical physiological. If it's equal. So proper questioning mechanism, how, where. When I say mechanism, I'm talking about ligature manual, if we can relate it, or the indications of that. Again, sometimes this, not for y'all so much, but law enforcement crime scene, we're looking at things left behind. We have had instances where we've recreated crime scenes and we're getting officers to look at kind of the chaos that's left and trying to figure out what was used versus what wasn't used. In the collection of evidence, where not just on the body and how the bodies were positioned and how they were positioned with each other, but the actual location of the criminal event. Backseat of a car like Emily Asbel, or front seat of the car, excuse me, some alleyway in the bedroom. I tell people all the time, especially when we run the scenarios at the academy, we have like 4 or 5 little houses, and the officers go through live scenario training. We have actors as not actors, they're instructors at the academy acting as victims and suspects. We set up crime scenes for everything you think of. And I always ask them when on one of their domestic calls that I'm related to now, like, where did the domestic incident occur? In the kitchen. Okay, but where in the kitchen? Because in this particular case, it's important to know where each of the 2 parts is. So in every house, you've got a room, but in every room, you've got spaces within that room as well. And again, knowing that situational and spatial relationship between victims and suspects can be really, really important. So that's what I'm talking about there. And then just, looking at these areas. There was a time that I did some training for, some of y'all might know Kenneth Schuler's cosmetology schools. They're real big in Columbia. They actually used to have me come in. There's a block of training where they talk about abnormal skin conditions, because when you're doing cosmetology work, you have to go through a block of training on skin conditions and communicable diseases and bloodborne pathogens and that sort of thing. And they used to have me come in and talk about strangulation, because sometimes people talk more to their cosmetologist than they do anyone else. And the cosmetologist happens to be working around that face, head, neck area. And you can see, I saw some of the men and women in there as I'm talking, they're going, like they remember something. Quite a few of them came up to me actually later and said they were a victim survivor of strangulation themselves. Quite a few of them actually. But I'm looking for these areas. And again, I want to try to get explanations if I can. And I try to be respectful of people. I don't want to necessarily put my hands all over them. But as a police officer, as someone who is trying to intervene on behalf of the victim, if I could have my way, I have my hands all over them. I want to look at everything. But I have to be respectful of their privacy as well. So I always ask permission. I empower them with giving them a choice. But also, I'll load that up with what my purpose and my role is to benefit them, and allow me to do those things. So has anybody seen that picture before? Yeah, y'all seen that picture before, right? So this comes from the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. Essentially, this lady, she's actually, she was strangled by her husband. She was kind of asymptomatic. Obviously, what you see on her face is not petechial hemorrhage. That's just, natural freckles and blemishes and that sort of thing. But she had some interaction with a victim advocate and had disclosed some things that led the victim advocate to believe that she needed to be seen. And she was very reluctant to do that. And with proper imaging and consultation, she was discovered to have 2 carotid artery dissections. That's her image right there. So again, she didn't feel any of this. We'll talk about this as we start to get towards the end about these carotid dissections and things such as that. So this was the CTA, which is one of the your go-to imaging suggestions. So signs and symptoms: headaches. I had on the list vomiting. Vomiting used to be on the list, but there's been less and less to support that vomiting is associated with the strangulation, and if it is, what the exact mechanism that what causes that. So I've taken it off. But headaches could be some things they complain about. Vision changes, obviously sore neck, throat, trouble swallowing, voice changes, bruising behind the ear. That's usually that sternoid cleidomastoid muscle. Sometimes that connective tissue gets damaged because, I mean, think about it. When somebody's strangled, there's a lot of, there can be a lot of pulling, stretching, torsion that takes place. That's what a lot of times contributes to the carotid dissections if there are there. Petechial hemorrhages, obviously, and loss of bowel control. So we have involuntary urination and defecation. Interviewed a USC student a couple of years ago. I don't actively investigate criminal charges, but I come across her case and talked to her, and she was very forthcoming, and we had a nice private sit down. And that's one of the things that she experienced. And as you might imagine, going through this event, she called her mother and her sister first. She didn't call law enforcement for days. She's like, what do I look like? I'm going to the bathroom on myself, and this is embarrassing. And so, as it relates to law enforcement, though, maybe even to some of you, if they have the involuntary urination or defecation, they're generally not in the clothes that happened. They've either thrown them away or done something else with them. Well, evidentiary, I need to know that. So there's times that officers go there and say, are these the clothes that you were in when the incident occurred? No. Why? Well, I went to the bathroom by myself. Okay, can you tell me what you did with them? Yeah, I threw them in the garbage can outside. Now, there's ways to collect that kind of stuff. And I may not necessarily collect it in a biohazard bag, but taking pictures of where it was disposed of. These are evidentiary things that are real important. Loss of memory. So evidence of anoxic injury, dizziness. Y'all can read this for yourself. Loss of memory. I'm going to focus on memory. A lot of times, this is one that I've seen, change of location. They'll say, I remember being here, but I don't know how I got there. Well, that indicates loss of consciousness. I can't say the loss of consciousness was absolutely and completely related to the strangulation, but I do have an indication there was loss of consciousness. I just may not know specifically what caused it right now, but that's a huge concern. You remember being in one place, but you don't know how you got to the other. You remember standing here, but now you're on the ground over there. Laryngeal injury, voice changes. It's still, all the research that I see, even the current stuff says about 50% of victims will suffer some type of voice change, and it's usually damage or pressure to the nerves. There used to be some images out there that showed vocal cords that were physically really damaged, but I think those were some bad images that were taken. Most of the medical professionals now say that it's generally due to compression of the nerves in the neck that are controlling the vocal cord. So you'll see that a lot. There's another slide I got coming up. So swallowing changes, difficulty swallowing, painful to swallow. Had a lot of victims say that they were again drinking water, and in spite of the fact they were consciously thinking to get it down their esophagus, it was wanting to go somewhere else. Have gone for days without being able to drink. Dehydrated, can't get any water down. They feel like they're drowning because they don't know all that stuff's kind of not working right down there. Breathing and voice changes. I always ask people, hey, is the way that you are talking, the way you sound, normal for you? Y'all remember Kathleen Turner, the actress, had the very deep voice, Romancing the Stone with, was it the Douglas guy?
She kind of talk with the deep voice like this sometimes.
That was her normal? Well, not Barry White, that's for sure. But ask them sometimes. It might be their normal voice. Probably not likely, but ask them. Sometimes they don't even know that their voice has changed until someone brings it to their attention. Huh? Kathleen. Oh, yeah. That's right. What? Yeah, Kathleen Turner, you're right. Some pretty other serious things can go. The pulmonary edemas, aspiration, pneumonitis. Obviously, when fluids start building up in the lungs, either from our GI system or just from the damage that's going on to our pulmonary system, it becomes a really, really serious problem. Talking to Dr. Smock and Dr. Dean Hawley years ago, they've had some patients that were in the hospital that nearly died because of the pneumonia, early onset and quick developing pneumonia as a result of the strangulation event. Hippocampus, this is really important. It's the first structure of the brain affected by lack of oxygen. It's also part of the brain that is responsible for storing memory. So don't expect your victims to be able to tell you in a linear story what happened. There will be gaps missing, and that is normal. Now, that's not just normal from lack of oxygen to the brain, but when you look at Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, who's did the threat assessments years ago. You know what I'm talking about? Her and a couple other nurses have, with some doctors, have documented a certain number of at least 5 hormones that are released into the body that actually have a relation to brain memory and storage, regardless if there's a lack of oxygen. But with respect to what we're talking about, yeah, if it's not working correctly because of lack of oxygen, then don't expect them to be able to tell you. And again, when we have lack of external injuries and they can't tell us a story that makes sense, we have a tendency to discredit them. When in actuality, it should point us into some more serious conversations as to why that occurs. Okay. Stroke risk. Ischemic stroke, embolic strokes, cryptogenic strokes, the ones of unknown origin, usually due to carotid dissection. So just real quick, so you got your carotid arteries, and again, due to the pulling, and the torsion that can occur during strangulation, you can get a carotid dissection. This is one of the big things Dr. Dean Hawley was real big about, and essentially a few different things can happen. This interior wall gets torn, and then we have, blood kind of pulling between the interior and the exterior wall. Sometimes it will kind of bulb out and actually rupture. But then you'll see a lot of blood pooling in the muscles of the neck. It won't be contained inside the artery. But essentially what this causes is it causes a huge risk for a blood clot being formed. The blood's sitting in there, it's kind of pooling. There's this little eddy that kind of creates from patterns of fluid flow, and the clot's sitting there, and without intervention, the person could die. They've had people die weeks after. I think reading some of the most recent literature, there was a pediatric case, and then there was another case, and it was literally I'm talking about months, like 20 something months later, they were able to tie a fatality back to a carotid dissection. So it can be really, really dangerous. Petechiae, again, isn't solely from strangulation, straining, medication, medical conditions. Any of y'all that have had children and a lot of pressure from childbearing, childbirth can cause petechial hemorrhages. Had friends of mine in college that were dry heaving because they drank too much alcohol and they had petechial hemorrhages, weightlifters. But with respect to the other signs and symptoms, we don't look at these signs and symptoms and go, oh, we see one, you're absolutely been strangled. We see the buildup of signs, symptoms, and indicators. And the more indicators we have, the higher the probability that they've been strangled. So you can't just say petechial hemorrhages alone. With more time, I would have lots and lots of pictures, but in the interest of time, I wanted to go into some other things. Neck lesions, pattern injuries. All right, so getting into the last phases here. So y'all probably have already seen them, but there are many, many, many types of screening forms now available for strangulation detection. Obviously, those of y'all working in forensic nursing are very have these, I think, as part of a standard operating procedure section, but not everybody gets screened. And so I'm a big proponent of, starting that screening process with our first point of intervention, whether that's law enforcement or the victim advocate or whatever, just going through these. You don't have to be a medical professional to use a lot of these screening forms. They're just observation abilities, what you are able to see, do I see this? Do I not see this? And so this one just happens to be an example from another agency, but I will tell you, when I was on the governor's domestic violence task force, we made one for South Carolina. We call it the domestic violence toolkit. It's there's a strangulation screening form in there, and all the forms are PDF fillable. So if you have a tablet or a computer, you can electronically fill out all the sections. You don't actually have to handwrite it, but if you want a hard copy print it, you can. And it's very generic. There's no agency name on the top of it. You just put the entity that you represent as the one that did the screening. The little assessment card, some of y'all got a copy of this. This was made by the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. Two things, obviously, are the checklist, which is this side, okay, which you see there. And again, just something to keep in your bag, keep in a little, take a picture of it, put it on your phone, and use it as a signs and systems checklist. And the other part of it, Got some, there's actually some others that have come out related to pediatrics, related to the pregnant patient as well, that are specific to pregnant women. And then notice to medical provider. And then the other section was notice to, I think I cut that off by accident. So there's one section that says, the advisements to patient and notice to medical provider. So those both things are, but what it does, it gives both those sections are specific to knowledge that the victim needs to know and medical service providers need to know. So I'm all about, empowering people with information. So tell everybody, keep this with you, make multiple copies, give it to people. Don't assume that people can read. Go through it with them. Sit down with the patient or your victim and go through the signs and symptoms, because sometimes their own self-awareness is the most powerful tool. You can sit there and tell them all day, but when they realize it for themselves, when they can see it in black and white, they know that a legitimate, a validated body has said, this is good stuff. They tend to give it, the power that it deserves and empower themselves. And then obviously with your medical provider, down here, there's going to be some consultation with neurology, ENTs, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute. The other handout is from the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. It's another good overall signs and symptoms, and you see some of them relate to neurological problems or deficits up here. This doesn't show up on these screens. And some of them are actually obviously signs and symptoms, physical characteristics, and neurological signs and symptoms as well. So it's a good thing to have. If you ever have to deal with victims, sometimes it can be hard for them to articulate exactly what happened, but they could show you. Don't have them do it on themselves. Don't have them do it on anybody else. I'm gonna tell you right now, your cosmetology schools, they throw away heads all the time. So like Kenneth Schuler's in Columbia, I'd go by there from time to time and I'd say, hey, do y'all have any of those heads laying around that I can have? Yep, and they'd give me a whole box of heads. And I would just give them out. They cost nothing. They're getting rid of them. They're a little bit used, but essentially all you need is the head and neck. And it becomes a nice tool for victims and survivors of strangulation to be able to show you what they can show you. I've even had some agencies kind of wrap up a towel, just take a towel and wrap it up in a kind of tube type of form with maybe some tape on it to hold it together and say, hey, show us how the person held you. So it's really important. Another screening form there. Now, this is also, and this is why this is a form that I promote a lot and I give to a lot of doctors. I showed this to the South Carolina Board of Medical Examiners, and I told them that I was pushing this into everybody's hand to give to everybody in the ED department. And, I told them, and they knew that I'm not a clinician. I'm not a physician like they are. And I know sometimes, depending on who's teaching in the audience, it can become an adversarial type of training. Because people say, well, don't tell me how to do my job. I'm a nurse. You're a police officer. Don't tell me how to do my job. I've also had, we've had nurses come in and do training for law enforcement, basically the same thing. You're a nurse. I'm an officer. Don't tell me how to deal with the mentally ill out here on the street when they're naked in 100-degree weather and they're fighting and kicking at me and trying to pound my face in. I get it. This is why I like multidisciplinary training. We need to have an understanding of the lens we all look through. The way that I look at things and the things that I have in my wheelhouse to be able to control the authorities that I have are different than yours. But if we understand what lens we all work through and have an understanding of our roles and responsibilities, it becomes a non-adversarial type of training environment. So I've had nurses tell me of stories where they were arguing with the attending physician at the emergency department about things that need to be done because they had training on strangulation, and they were like pressing the doctor, look, you need to do this, you need to do this. I'm not doing it. They're asymptomatic. I think that's unnecessary. It's cost too much. We got 10 people already, lined up for CTs and everything. And so I've even encountered law enforcement officers around the country who, as either the law enforcement investigator or the law enforcement victim advocate with the victim down at the hospital, talking with some of the nurses and doctors and having that same kind of argument. Don't tell me how to do my job and what imaging things I need to be, So what I tell people, especially in whatever way they want to use this is a flow chart that the Institute on Strangulation Prevention created by their board of medical professionals, Dr. Dean Hawley, Dr. Bill Smott, Dr. William Green, well-established national, international experts in trauma medicine who specifically focus and know about strangulation, have developed this flow chart for any doctor to follow, to go by with all the imaging and consultation recommendations. So when I tell people, it's not me, the law enforcement officer, telling you, doctor, what to do. These are your peers telling you what to consider if you want to be patient-centered. You know, we're not asking you to build a criminal case. We're asking you to take care of the victim. And so usually with that type of approach, like this is your peers, this comes from people that are your equal, but specialized, it comes across as being better received. Now, I can't say that they always do the imaging and they always follow a flow chart, because it talks about, again, evaluation of, non-fatal strangulation, medical, radiological. So it talks in here about consultation with your ENTs and neurology, doing your MRIs and your CTAs with contrast and everything, and what you should do. The other part of that, in the backside of it, is if they go, where does this stuff come from? The backside has all the references. There's got to be like 25 or 30 medical references that validate what is here. So again, don't believe me. Believe the people that put this together, that are your peers. So that's available online as well. And it gives signs, symptoms, and talks about anoxic brain injury and loss of consciousness indications there. So different ways we can document this medically. The laryngoscopes. How many of y'all, do y'all know of anybody that's using the fibered cameras, the wired cameras instead of the laryngoscope? Dr. Smock, he uses those. A lot more medical professionals are using those. So what they'll do is they'll use a speculum to hold the victim's mouth open, and they'll take the fibered camera. And a lot of these aren't even like clinical grade stuff. It's just these. You can buy them off of Amazon to hook up to your cell phone. They use a different hookup, but they can put the camera, these high definition cameras, further back into the throat and actually record video and do some other stuff. So just look that up if you're curious about it. It's out there. But the MRI, the head, the neck, the CTA, Dr. William Green out there in California, he wrote the medical portion book for investigating non-fatal strangulation for medical professionals. These are the words that he used. CTAs are still one of the best exams because of accessibility, speed, safety, specificity, and sensitivity. It's one of the easiest and best things to do. Now, as far as getting that ordered and it actually taking place might be a different thing, but that is definitely what they are promoting when it comes to non-fatal strangulation documentation and exams. So these are some images that some of y'all might be familiar with, that things that can be seen. And then you get into all the 3D and 4D and color enhancement and all that kind of stuff that's coming out now. It's just getting better every day. Okay, so I am a published author. So talk about, as we wrap this up, threats to other people other than the strangulation, strangled victim. So this is one of my articles that I wrote for Law Enforcement Technology magazine that's now overseen by officer.com, called Subtle Signs of a Killer, Non-Fatal Strangulation Points to Future Homicides. What the article basically backs up is that obviously our strangled victims are at a very, very high risk of being killed by firearm, non-fatal strangulation being the number one indicator that will happen. It also is showing that there is a much higher than average incidence of law enforcement officers being involved in a critical incident. What we mean by critical incident would be a law enforcement officer being shot or having to shoot the offender. And what they found out for some research is that in those type of instances where officers were shot or had to shoot, about 80%, roughly 80% of those incidents involved domestic violence offenders who used non-fatal strangulation on their targets. So again, if you're willing to harm your intimate partner, you're willing to harm a police officer. And particularly when you use non-fatal strangulation, your idea about death and dying, you don't care. You'll kill anybody. All right. And the public is at risk. Say, what do you mean? Yeah, well, I talked to you about collateral damage, like the friends and family that might be around the victim during that time who may intervene or just be in that chaotic event where the offender now decides just to wipe out everybody. But in that same article, I've brought up some, so y'all might remember the Pulse nightclub shooting down in Florida. I think it was Orlando. They killed the gentleman, Omar Mateen. He went down there and I think he killed, oh gosh, it was over 50 people. He had a documented history of strangling his intimate partners. We had, I can't remember the guy's name, but we had a church shooting out in Texas. Guy went into a church. Yep. He went into a church with AR-15 with the intentions of finding his wife and killed like 15 or 16 people. 26. Yeah. So she knows. Because there's so many in my head, I get some of the numbers messed up, but because there's a lot of them out there. But he had a documented history. Now, here's the weird thing about him. He had been in the Air Force. He had strangled his wife in the Air Force and fractured his son's skull, son's small kid. He was given a dishonorable discharge, but was allowed by the JAG court to plead guilty to a misdemeanor, not a felony. So he wasn't banned from firearms purchasing prohibitions because he wasn't a convicted felon. Had the charge stood, even in the judicial the military court, and he was convicted of a felony, and he had a dishonorable discharge, then he would have had a firearm prohibition, but he didn't. He was allowed to plead to something less. We also had another shooting of a gentleman at an airport in Miami. This guy, him and his girlfriend were involved in a relationship in Alaska where he had strangled her repeatedly, and he was charged as felonies, but was allowed to plead to a misdemeanor, which still allowed him access to a gun. And he flew from Alaska to Miami with one bag that contained a firearm. He put it in check bags. He gets it off the conveyor belt, goes in the bathroom, pulls out a gun, and shoots a bunch of people in the Miami airport. Those are just a few of what we call mass shooting incidents that involve people who've used non-fatal strangulation against their intimate partners. So again, this risk goes far beyond the immediacy of that targeted individual victim. Okay. So strangulation bill, last few things as we wrap this up. The first bill was Senate Bill 172 and Senate Bill 195. That was sponsored by Senator Katrina Shealy out of Lexington. The first, as y'all know, the legislative session is a 2-year cycle. We're actually in the getting ready to go into the second half of this next legislative session, but the first couple years, I didn't go anywhere. There's hundreds and hundreds of bills that are introduced every year by every legislator. And it's kind of what cream kind of rises to the top, and some stuff gets pushed way to the bottom. We didn't really get anywhere. Senate Bill 195 got a little bit more traction. We actually went to the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee, where it was debated and where I gave testimony about how far behind South Carolina is and how we desperately need this. We had victims, we had a ton of people up there to give testimony in support of it. It went into full committee where it died. It was other bills got given precedence. So we had to refile. And again, because at the end of every legislative cycle, if it dies, you got to refile the bill. So the current bill number is H 3684, House Bill 3684. One of the House of Representative members is actually sponsoring that bill. Ironically, he is a registered nurse, so he had a really good understanding of the need for this bill. And so there is a task force in the works to discuss the promotion of this bill, and I'm not part of that task force. I do give some insight into it, but because of my position at the academy, I can't be part of a task force that I'm not specifically assigned to. I have been part of task forces before, but I have to have my director's permission to be an active member. But it defines strangulation, different forms of strangulation, and it establishes a mandatory felony of 5 years. Would like to get higher, but you got to start somewhere. And the thing about it is we got to start somewhere. This is we haven't done anything effectively. All the other states have leaving us way behind. It kind of started on the West Coast, and it's coming to the East Coast, and we're like the last one standing. All right, now the other thing that I'm really excited about that I'll finish up with is this idea that I came up with, and I'll try to be as concise as I can to try to express how important this is. So thermal imaging, a lot of people have heard of alternative lighting sources, and infrared imaging. It's some of the same science, but used a different way. After the advanced strangulation course back in 2015, I happened to come across a group called the American Academy of Thermography. And they're in Greenville, South Carolina at Bon Secours Hospital up there. Dr. Bobby Schwartz, he is a pain management doctor. He's been around for 40 something years. They are basically the governing body that sets the clinical imaging and interpretation standards for thermographers all over the world. They have a worldwide reach. And so I tapped into him, and I was sitting in the office one day and I was like, could there be anything that would allow us to enhance our knowledge, our vision, or allow for better indications of non-fatal strangulation when there are no external injuries that we see with our naked eye? And so looking at like forensic, secure digital forensic imaging, what a lot of the forensic nurses use, I talked to them and they were like, well, you know, our software and our cameras, we kind of enhance what is already there. It's like you can see something, but we enhance it to a greater degree, more prominent to be shown. But as far as if there's nothing there, we're not really sure that we could do that. So when I reached out to Dr. Schwartz, I went to him and I said, I think that thermal imaging could be used in picking up on signs, symptoms, and indicators of non-fatal strangulation. And he said, well, you know what, come to our conference. Let's talk about it. So I did a short presentation on non-fatal strangulation. And there were doctors there. It's an international conference that sometimes is virtual, sometimes is in Atlanta. So the doctors that are there from all over the world have been using thermal imaging in clinical use for sports injuries, breast cancer screening, diabetic ulcer treatment, and pain management. Dr. Marcos Brioski in Brazil has one of the largest thermal clinics in South America. He is the doctor for the Brazilian national soccer team. He has diabetic ulcer treatment clinics everywhere. So he's been using it for decades. Dr. Julie Horner, she's a breast cancer survivor. She does breast cancer screenings. Now, these are not the only doctors, but there's a huge amount of clinical use using thermal imaging. Now, it is not a definitive tool. It's not even considered a diagnostic tool. They use it as an indicator tool to do other screenings, but they have found it to be very, very successful in a lot of ways. And it's been used in veterinary science for 20 years. So where we are right now is, these are some images that I took. I'll talk to you later about how I did all that. But that's kind of things it can show. And so what we're trying to do now is we're trying to validate, and what we're trying to build now is research universities, forensic units to start building an atlas of normal versus abnormal imaging, and to establish this for forensic use using the Daubert-Frye test in criminal trials. I will tell you that some of the imaging equipment out there right now is FDA approved. It has gone through the FDA approval procedures to be used in clinical settings, and these companies are ready to go. So we want to do a validation study. We want to have it peer reviewed and put through IRB peer reviews and published. And we're trying to do a 2-year image collection to establish that these ideas are valid. If you want any, so from our law enforcement officers, anybody, if you want free strangulation training, if you type in online strangulation training to the internet, you will come up with this portal from the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. You can take this course. It's a fully interactive 20 to 25-minute interactive course. Come back and take the post test. You get a free certificate. Doesn't cost you a dime. So if people want a good working knowledge of strangulation and they only got a few minutes worth of time, that right there is where I'm going to send you to. It will blow your mind. And we were right on the money at 1 o'clock. Does anybody have any questions? I know that was like I was feeding you with a fire hose, I know. But hopefully I've stirred some passion in you. Yes, ma'am. Yep, it is. And that's always been the big question. And that's where a lot of other states who have developed statutes and developed the framework for victim services and victim compensation have tapped into those systems that have been built using grants I don't know the exact number, but in South Carolina alone, there is tens of millions of dollars in VAWA grant money that does not get used. Brian's opinion here, I think if we have a statute, I think that would prompt and kind of press the building of better resources to pay, because I know cost is always a thing, and especially when you got victims who may not have a lot of money or insurance, and the hospitals always want to cover their costs. But that should not be a barrier. It should not be a barrier to victim care, but we know that sometimes it is. With more time, and I can do some research for you, they've done some studies with the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. I'm hoping I'm saying this number right, but the last I saw, when they tracked the long-term cost of not triaging a strangulation victim over the course of their life, it comes out to costing almost $500,000 in total cost to not just the victim, but the medical interventions that they need throughout their life. If we'd have done just a better job of spending that money a little more wisely on the front end, we could save ourselves a lot of cost on the back end.
I just know if I deal with the organization fund, that I get called a lot about charges.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
We have a question from online.
Yeah.
How often are educational opportunities offered to like the average law enforcement officer in the state regarding trauma-informed interviews?
Okay, so with respect to the academy, we do have individuals that will do classes on that. They just send a letter of a request to the director seeking that training opportunity, and logistically we can plan it. I'll also say that there are a number of private training corporations. I don't know, the names escape me right now, but there's one called the Public Agency Training Council, which did at one time have some trauma-informed interviewing classes available at cost, though. I mean, it costs to put on these classes. There was also, I can't remember the name, but Mike and Tina Gooding, they're retired law enforcement officers from South Carolina. They have a training and consulting business, and they have done training on the national level of trauma-informed interviewing. But so there are opportunities out there. Sometimes they're more specific, sometimes they're regionalized, sometimes they're by request only. But with my contact information, if anybody emails me, I can start to track down some of those sources, because they sometimes they kind of come and go depending on interest and costs. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Now, is that the Stop Violence Against Women program through the AG's office, or is that? Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, that's the past couple of years, that's been one of the big pushes, is to change the way that we ask questions, because the way that we've been doing it does not produce good results that we can follow up on. We're too brash and too aggressive with our approach sometimes. Exactly. And I was guilty of it as a new officer. I wanted to get down to the business real quick, which means very short, pointed questions, and that is not the approach that we need, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I'll be glad to talk with you. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. I will tell you that the systems that existed back in 2016, when we actually did the study and the research, those systems are still in place. They don't talk to each other. So we still have the same problem. I will tell you, and I didn't bring it, but I did actually have some stats from Charleston County. When I say Charleston County, we actually, back in 2016, there was a study done specific to Charleston County and all the municipalities that existed law enforcement wise. And just from that perspective, what they were showing was that, and y'all may or may not be aware of this, but when we write incident reports, we have something called UCR codes, Uniform Crime Report codes, that are established by the FBI. And they don't always accurately reflect what is in the narrative of the report. So they did a search of reports that encompass words like choking, strangulation, that sort of thing. And what they found is that there were a lot of reports that were titled something other than assault or aggravated assault, but that had indications that a strangulation occurred. And that's just an example within the law enforcement field of, and it's called SCIBRS, the South Carolina Incident-Based Reporting System. So when law enforcement agencies write their incident reports, it goes to SCIBRS, and then SCIBRS transmits that information to the FBI database. And so just within the realm of documentation, we don't always have the proper categories picked. And that's just within that. I can't just go in there and go find all incident reports. There's no UCR code for me to search for strangulation. You know, and people say, well, how does that change? Well, FBI would have to change that. So again, it goes back to that our systems that don't communicate well are still in existence. I think it would definitely start moving. Again, Brian's opinion, I think it would start moving the pendulum forward. Because again, I think once there's an established law, everyone, regardless of discipline, is going to have an awareness and training. And then with all criminal statutes, the only way we gauge its success is to make it trackable. And I think that's going to start to push the needle that systems, not just the hardware. I'm gonna tell you right now, y'all, some computer systems, it's still, y'all probably remember the old green screen computers. It's just monochrome green screen. Some of the systems still operate on those type of systems. And so you can imagine software and compatibility is a huge problem. So long answer to a short question. Yeah, I believe it will move the needle that way. That's what I'm hoping for. That's the only way we gauge our success. It has to be something measurable. Yep. All right. Well, y'all, that ends the day. Thank y'all so much for touching. Karen's got some information for you.
Okay, so for the nurses that are watching, I have to show you this. There it goes. And we need, this is to get your CEs. So take a picture of that. And you can fill that out. I've got a sign-in sheet for nurses to sign in. On the back of that, if everyone else could just put their name and where they're from and their email, that way we can contact you for other stuff that we have going on. So any questions? All right. Now, if you guys have, if you MUSC, if you have a patient that you believe was strangled, and you need assistance, the forensic nurses, we have all that documentation, and we've got the little sheet that has all the references for any physicians that may want to see that. And just so you know, our ER does a very good job, and they do follow those guidelines. So for the adult our ER. So I think that's it. So are we good? All right. Thank you very much. This was sponsored by the MUSC Intimate Partner Violence Steering Committee and my sister's house.